I really wish you a successful day 2. I'll be back on stage a bit later with Mario, but please put your hands together for Mario Flores. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Thanks to all the people at TransferRoom for inviting me. So for the next 30 to 35 minutes, I will go through the new agent regulations and the main principles that will govern those regulations. Probably you've seen them already published at FIFA.com. So the main goal is to make this as practical as possible. So the theory, everybody can read it, everybody can go through the regulations and read what it says. But I think it's important that you think about practical issues that you may encounter under these new regulations, and that then you ask that question. I promise I will answer to the best of my abilities. I hope that correctly. So first, I think it's important to do a bit of a background. As you can see, this is a long process that started in September 2018, when the so-called FIFA Football Stakeholders Committee approved the main principles that would govern the new FAR, as it's called. The Football Stakeholders Committee is just a FIFA standing committee that has the main stakeholders in football, including, of course, the ECA, but not only clubs. They also have the FIFA, the players, the national associations, the leagues, and at the early stage there were also agencies involved. So this was a process that involved 3 different drafts of the FAR, just to end up the final draft that was approved by the Council in December of 2022. Now we are in the part that is called the licensing period, that FIFA calls it, which is only some parts of the regulations have entered into force, mainly those related to how an agent can obtain the license, when they have to pass the exam, where to pay the annual license fee, etc. And then the full entry into force will be in October of 2023, where as of that date, every agent that wants to perform agent services will have to be licensed. And all clubs and players that want to engage an agent need to make sure that he or she is properly licensed. So I think as a bit of a context, it's important to mention that everybody speaks about the cap and so on and so forth, but this is a relatively complex piece of legislation that has many obligations to all parties involved, agent, clubs, players included, and therefore it's important that you bear in mind this. Do not only focus on the caps, really focus on all the other aspects that this entails. These are more or less the 6 principles that I drawn up from these regulations. I will go through them all, but it's important to have a bit of a roadmap on this. So to start, the requirements for the license. Now the license will be a worldwide license, which means that any agent that has a FIFA license will be able to perform football agent services in the entire world. As you know now, you need to be registered in each national association on the so-called regulations of working with intermediaries. Those will be repealed, and now after you obtain this FIFA license, the agent will be able to perform their services worldwide. There is some character requirements, eligibility requirements, one of which, for example, is that if you have a criminal record, you are completely out. So a person that has a criminal conviction cannot be an agent. There's others that you can find is in Article 5. Those are an exhaustive list, so if you have an agent has a doubt about this, can go through them. The exam, we understand that it's a 75% passing mark. The latest data that we have from FIFA, from the mock test, because an agent can do mock tests, is that around 80% of potential agents are failing to meet this mark. So let's see when the time comes how is this. And there are also going to be what is called continuous professional development, which is our courses basically that an agent will have to go through the life of the license in order to continue being eligible. So let's start with the principles. Of course, the first one is 1 agent per party. So this is the starting point on the football agent regulations. Every party involved in a transaction has to have their own agent. Of course, every agent general has their exceptions, and they go with the first one, which is the multiple representation. Now here you have a case where, I don't know if you are familiar with that player, but was a very colorful Mexican player of the 90s. He's been transferred by Besiktas to Rangers, and this little agent here has a representation agreement with Besiktas as a releasing club and the player Is this allowed? This would not be allowed. Under the new regulations, an agent cannot represent the releasing club and the player in the same transaction. Of course, all three parties will also be forbidden. This is a bit of an obvious, in my view at least, conflict of interest. Now, the multiple representation will be allowed if an agent represents the engaging club and the player. Here, of course, in the ideal scenario is that that agent will represent the new club in the transfer agreement with the releasing club and the player in the negotiation of the employment contract. So it's even if it's a dual representation, it's a bit of a two-step kind of process. First, you negotiate the transfer agreement on behalf of the new club, and only thereafter you negotiate the employment contract. There's further limits to the actual multiple representation. So here you have a case where Rangers will offer the player a $200K US contract on 1 year. Of course, I will go on to this, but the commission in this case will be 10%. I will explain why, which is 20K. Now imagine that the parties agree that Rangers will pay 15K of that commission and the player will only be obliged to pay 5K. This is not allowed. In case of dual representation, the new club can pay up to 50% of the total commission. They cannot pay more. So maximum, the club will have to pay 10K and the player will be obliged to pay the other 10K. So there is a further limitation. The regulations foresee a figure called connected football agent. So basically a connected football agent are two agents that, for example, are employees of the same agency, that have some kind of partnership between each other, that are related in terms of blood, for example, siblings, a dad and a son. I think it goes until the first or second level, I don't have it now in my mind, or that they have worked together in the past for more than one occasion. This is called connected football agents. If two connected football agents act in the same transaction, they are bound by the same rules of multiple representation. So in this case, if these two agents work for the same agency, this transaction will not be allowed because it will be connected football agents acting for the releasing entity and the player, which is a multiple representation that is not allowed. Of course, if they both work in different agencies and have no connection whatsoever, then there is no problem. So those are multiple representation kind of rules in general. Now let's go to the cap on commissions, the elephant in the room, I guess. So the general rule is this: an agent that represents the engaging club is 10% of the transfer fee, the cap. An agent representing the player is 3% of the gross annual remuneration, and an agent representing the engaging club is also at 3% of the gross annual remuneration. Now the remuneration, it's important that I make this distinction, includes every payment due to the player, including conditional payments, with the exception of two things: sell-on fees. So if a player retains what is called their economic rights, that percentage will not be included in the commission, or any other kind of benefits such as accommodation, a vehicle, housing, etc. So those kind of things would not enter into the gross remuneration. Conditional payments do, and it's important that you remember this for a thing that I will explain a little further on. Now, in case of dual representation, this 3% goes up to 6% of the gross remuneration. The one of the releasing club does not change. Now there is, as you remember in one of the first slides, we saw that the agent was entitled to 10%. And this happens when the annual remuneration of the player is equal or less than $200,000 annually. The cap on the commission goes from 3% to 5%. So it's one of the situations where the cap goes higher. In case of dual representation, this goes, of course, to 10%. So in the example that we saw, because the player was earning $200,000, that means that agent was entitled to receive 10% of the gross remuneration. this is where the regulations start to be a bit complicated. The cap is not a fixed cap, it's what it's called a progressive cap, which means that even if a player is earning more than 200,000, the first 200,000 of the commission will be calculated on the 5%. So if a player is earning, as an example, a 1 million gross annual salary, 5% will be calculated on the first 200,000, and the 3% on the remaining 800,000. So it's not 3% on the entire amount, it's always the 5% or 10% on the first 200,000 of the remuneration, and then on the remaining that you would apply the general 3% commission. So to give a bit of an example of how this will work in practice, we have the same situation about a player being transferred to Rangers. Let's say that Rangers offers him an annual contract of 1.2 million, which is payable in 12 equal monthly installments of 100K from 1st January 24 until December 24. Now, the commission is 40K, and this is one of the examples that I was telling you before, is 40K is not 3% of 1.2 million. 40K is applying 5% to the first 200,000 and then applying 3% to the extra 1 million. That's how you get the commission. There is also some limit as to how this commission is to be paid. As far as we understand, nowadays agents always usually ask for the entire commission up front. And this is obvious because once they get the commission up front, then of course they don't mind of what happens in the duration of the contract. It was felt that this needed to be limited. Therefore, the commission needs to be paid first only after the relevant registration period has closed. So, for example, if this transaction occurred in January 24, so only once that registration window has closed, then the payments of the commission can start, and they need to be paid in installments every 3 months. So you cannot pay as a club in one installment, which means that the commission in this case will have to be paid like this. It will have to be paid at first, 13,000 euros, and then 3 payments of 9,000 euros. The first payment is higher because, again, the first 200K you apply a higher commission, so this first payment will be higher. This is mandatory. Clubs are not, or parties in general, are not allowed to deviate from this payment mechanism by means of a contractual arrangement. Now let's imagine that this player was transferred in the summer. So the contract was 1 year, but after 6 months he cannot really adapt to Rangers, and then Rangers decides to transfer him further. This is called Salhiris in Lithuania. And he's transferred in July 2024. Now the regulations provide that if the player is transferred, so if the negotiated contract ends because the player is further transferred, any commission that has not fallen due by then is not due. So in this case, the agent will not be entitled to receive, or the club obliged to pay, these 2 installments because they have not fallen due when the player was transferred. The logic behind this is that it is assumed that the agent of the player is the same, so whenever he's transferred to another club, that agent will receive this part of the commission but under the new contract. Otherwise, he would receive the commission twice. Because, of course, when he's transferred the player, he will also receive commission from that new transfer, and so he will be paid twice the commission for the same period of time. This is the reason behind this. So this goes to caps. Now, if we move to the client pays principle. So again, same as every one agent per parties, each client has to pay his own agent. This is the general rule. There is an exception. Similar as in the higher commission, if a player is earning equal or less than 200,000 gross annual remuneration, then in this scenario, the club is entitled or is permitted to pay the commission that is otherwise due by the player. Now, there is a bit of a nuance here, and there's two things that I wanted to discuss. I hope I'm clear. Remember that I told you that the conditional payments are counted towards the whole remuneration. So they are included in the remuneration on which the commission is calculated. However, to determine whether it's less than 200,000 or not, and therefore that the club can pay on behalf of the player, you do not take this into account. So imagine a player that is earning 150,000 fixed salary plus 100,000 conditional payments because of goals scored or whatever that you think of. That would make the entire remuneration of 250,000. And the entire remuneration, the commission would be calculated. However, given that the fixed remuneration is less than 200,000, in that case, the club can still pay on behalf of the player. Again, this conditional payment is taken for the entire remuneration to calculate, but it's not taken into account whenever you have to determine whether the club can pay on behalf of the player. And that has a second implication that I probably should have mentioned it during the caps, but it works the same with the caps. If you have a player that is earning 200,000 fixed and has conditional payments of 100,000, so a total amount of 300,000, the remuneration of the agent will be calculated on the entire 300,000, and the 5% will apply also on the entire 300,000. Because to determine if the 3% or the 5% applies, you do not consider the conditional payment. Which means that there is an incentive to have more conditional payments for all parties, because the agent knows that if you have a conditional payment, that will be included in your commission and it's not going to count towards whether the 5% or the 3% applies. If it's not clear, you can come to me after so I can go into more detail with this. I heard noise, so maybe I will give it more. So we go to minor players. There is also a bit of a restrictions about condition minor players. So imagine that you have Marinho, it's a Brazilian, born on 1st March 2009. Sporting has some scouting that actually has looked at this player and it's interesting in the player. They approach. Another aspect is the minimum age in Portugal to sign an employment contract is 16 years old. So of course Neymar is yet to reach that age. Nevertheless, Sporting goes to agent and says, I want you to approach this player and convince him to come to Portugal and join my academy. This is not allowed. So any approach to a minor can only be made at least 6 months before he can sign a contract in the club where he is intended to be registered or employed. So in this case, because it's more than 6 months before he can actually do that, this is not allowed. You cannot approach a minor player under these circumstances. And this is one of the few provisions where there is an explicit sanction. So if you see the regulations, it usually refers to the FIFA disciplinary committee to actually impose sanctions or violations. This is one of the few that is actually implicit, and basically it's a fine plus a suspension of the license for 2 years. Now, of course, it's I guess that some of you or most of you are thinking about, well, yeah, this looks very nice, and especially clubs actually have approached me and say, well, this looks very nice, but it's not going to matter because people are simply going to circumvent the regulations because that's how it's always happened. So first, to be honest, I don't think that's a valid argument because otherwise why do you have any regulations or even laws at all? But leaving that aside is the regulations do foresee several enforcement provisions that are aimed to ensure that the regulations are not circumvented. Of course, this will happen and people will try to circumvent, but it's not going to be that easy, at least in my view. So you have like 4 kind of things around it. You have the online platform. Now I said FIFA TMS there, but I was informed that it's a different platform. So all representation agreements will have to be uploaded in this platform, or licensing will have to be register in that platform. I will go a bit into detail into what's called other services agreements. So for example, if you conclude a scouting agreement with an agent, and you're a club and you find a scouting agreement with an agent, you also have to upload this agreement onto this platform. You will have the clearinghouse. At the moment, the clearing, I don't know if you heard about the clearinghouse, and now it's operational, and all solidarity and trading rewards payments are being processed through the clearinghouse. The goal is that for the commissions also be processed through the clearinghouse. This is a middle term objective as far as I understand. So in October, when all these things starts to kick in, this is not yet going to be operational, so payments will have to be made directly between parties. But the goal is that eventually the commissions will be paid through the clearinghouse. As I was mentioning, you have several obligations imposed on all parties, and you have a list of, according to the disciplinary code, of heavy sanctions. Now, our understanding is that FIFA will really need to go hard on the first cases that they found a breach of this, otherwise the message will be completely diluted. So we envisage that FIFA will pay a lot of attention to this. So to give a bit of an example of how this may work in practice. So you have again our little player being transferred this time from Rangers to Sporting. He has an agent that is going to act for Sporting and the player in the same transaction. He is properly licensed. You have a contract of 3 years for 30 million. He's going to pay the max commission. Each party is going to pay 50%. So all is good. Suddenly, it comes out that there was a scouting agreement that was signed between the agent and Sporting, right? And that scouting agreement basically said that the agent was entitled to X amount of money, whatever you can think of, for scouting services. And this comes by weekly, let's say. Now, what happens then? So there are several provisions in the agent regulations that will come into place. First, as I was mentioning, the regulations foresee what is called other services. So any other service that you can think of that an agent can provide to a club are included in other services. The most obvious being legal, scouting services, financial planning, accounting, negotiation of commercial contracts, because it's important to bear in mind, image rights agreements are not covered by the FAR. So any negotiation of an image rights agreement will be outside of the scope of the FAR. However, it will be other services, so you have to upload it in the platform. As I was mentioning, you have to upload in the platform any agreement that includes other services. Now, the regulations provide for an assumption that any other service provided within the 24 months, either before or after, of the transaction is deemed included as football agent services. So if you get a scouting agreement that was concluded within the 24 months, either after or before of the main transaction, that money paid will be considered part of the commission. The parties will have the possibility to rebut that presumption by proving that those services were actually provided and that they are not overvalued. So for example, in this case, FIFA will probably go and say, we'll start an investigation against the agent at Sporting, and will basically first say, hey, I noted this scouting agreement, it was public, you have to upload it in the platform, and it's not, you need to explain me why it's not. Then they will request the agent to provide evidence that this scouting agreement was actually performed, so that the agent perhaps traveled to some academies, maybe flight tickets, maybe reports, whatever written evidence that you can think of, those will be required to prove. If the agent doesn't prove this, or FIFA is not comfortably satisfied that this has been proven, then FIFA will consider the payment of the scouting fee as part of the commission, and of course, if the agent was already earning the maximum commission, that payment will make it breach the cap, and sanctions will be imposed. So that is why it's not going to be so easy to actually circumvent the cap by means of concluding separate agreements. And the same applies for legal services, financial planning, and other aspects that I mentioned. So this is other point that has been raised recently, is how these regulations will affect existing representation agreements. So, roughly speaking, you have these four kind of scenarios on the left-hand side. First, you have a representation agreement that was signed before 16 December 2022, that is when the Council approved the FAR. You have cases where the representation agreement was signed before 16 December, but the transaction occurred before that date and October. So, for example, all transactions that will be happening during this next summer. And then you have representation agreements signed where both the transaction was signed after October and the entire representation agreement was signed after October. Now, the easy part is the first and the second and the last two, right? So, in one of which, the first one doesn't matter when a transaction applies. If the representation agreement was signed before this date, the FAR will not apply. So, if an agent and a player have a representation agreement that was, let's say, from the summer 2022 until the summer 2024, and the player is transferred in January 2024, and that agent has a 10% commission, that's still possible. It's not going to be a problem because that representation agreement was signed before December 2022. Of course, that has implication, which is that FIFA will lack jurisdiction over everything. So if the player doesn't pay the agent can go to FIFA to seek relief. They will have to go wherever, to national court or the CAS or whichever other. The last two is the same. They apply in full. So if the representation agreement was signed after October, of course, it applies in full. If the transaction also was signed after October, it applies in full. Now, the tricky part is those representation agreements have been signed between December 2022 and October 2023. So in those scenarios, what you need to focus, both clubs and agents, is when the transaction actually occurs. So if an agent, I think I have some examples here. So if you have a July 2023 representation agreement, as I was mentioning, the negotiating contract started in January 2024 with a 20% commission. Now in this case, the representation agreement was signed after December, but before October. Now, of course, then in principle, that representation agreement is not covered by the FAR because it's before October. However, the transaction occurred after October. The transaction is the actual transfer agreement, negotiation of employment contract, etc. If this is the case, then FIFA will not allow this. Because the transaction, even if the representation agreement was signed before October, the transaction occurred after October and the 20% commission breaches the cap. Another example is if you have a tripartite representation agreement in July 2023 and the commission is paid between October and July. This is possible. Why? Because the transaction occurred before October. So even if the payments fell due after October, the transaction occurred before October. So remember, what matters the most is when the transaction actually occurred. Whether the payments fall due after this, it doesn't really matter. So I mean, this is just, I think, the end of the presentation, just to give a bit of a, I take the liberty to mention that these are the legal services that we provide. We actually mostly are focused on our members, of course, on the ACA members. Nevertheless, if we have the capacity, we sometimes also try to assist other clubs. Of course, if you feel free, just please contact us whenever you want, can. Those are our contact details. We are I deal with sports legal. We also have a general counsel that couldn't be here, unfortunately, and our head of commercial legal. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions around this. That is enough for me speaking. Now the tricky part of the questions. And thanks, I hope that it was useful.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you very much, Mario. We saw people taking notes and taking pictures, so I think you're going to be busy today. We have about 20 minutes before we're going to release you for a break. So I'll kick off the questions, and we have got a member of the team roaming around with a microphone, so please just raise your hand and Mario will do his best to answer. So just based on everything you said there, what do you think the biggest challenges will be in the negotiation process with agents for clubs from the new rules?
Yeah, I think the first thing is a reckoning for all parties that inevitably this is going to change a bit of the industry. And basically the practices that now, or that has occurred for the past few years are going to have to change. That is a good thing because that's actually one of the objectives of the regulations, to actually modify the behavior of the football industry when it comes to negotiating contracts. So I guess the first challenge is that it's a cultural challenge. You need to change that mindset, which sometimes is, from experience, not only in football, but in other aspects of life, it's quite challenging. And the second, I think that was the first, and the second one is to actually get into the technicalities of the regulations. I mean, as I try to explain as clear as possible, nevertheless, it's not so clear still. So we need to see how FIFA will interpret those regulations. Just to give an example now, that actually even caught me by surprise is FIFA now released a Q&A that is quite extensive. So if you have any doubts, you can go and check. And one of those Q&A actually, FIFA seems to suggest that to deduct the commission that a player owes to an agent from his employment contract is allowed. So that actually a club can actually deduct from the remuneration, the commission, and then pay the agent. But it might be that's exactly what is not supposed to be allowed, because if you deduct it, then it's the club actually paying it. And at the end of the day, client pays, the objective was to educate players. Because players sometimes they sign, they don't care, I don't care how much you pay my agent, just pay it directly. So if this is allowed, that could potentially be in conflict with that educational objective. So again, this is something that will be developed. And of course, the final point is, this is being challenged now. As far as I understand, there is challenges open in Belgium, in Germany, potentially in the Netherlands. Some agencies are not happy with this. And that's a bit of uncertainty, right? Because everything that I talked to you about maybe doesn't happen because the challenge is successful to a certain degree. FIFA is quite confident. We were involved in the process and we are also quite confident about the legality of this. But it's also that uncertainty that is a bit of a challenge.
Are you able to just go a bit in depth of what those challenges were from those few countries that they've raised?
Well, we're not familiar with the particularities at all. We just are aware that they were filed in these courts seeking what is called an injunction, so seeking for a court to order that those regulations do not apply in their own territory. One can hypothetically speak of maybe against EU law, or I don't know which legal argument they may be using, but that's a bit of the general challenge.
Okay, so TBC in that area, essentially.
You could.
Yeah, okay. Were there any questions in the audience? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name is Pascal Siduris, I'm an agent. I will be quick, I only have like 20-25 questions very quickly. All right, first of all about the payment structure from the player, I think it will be very difficult because where are we invoicing and how is the expense from the player calculated? You know, it's not so easy, I think, from the practical way. So allowing the club to pay on behalf of the player maybe still is the right way to do it. But okay, the question is, in an extension of a contract, of an existing contract, are we still eligible to get money from both sides, like 3 and 3%? That's okay?
Yes.
And then the last one, a selling club, okay? The payment structure that you mentioned before probably is unconditional of the player leaving the club earlier because you're already getting the money from the selling club, I mean, yes? But the payment structure, is there any structural method or you can just get the money up front?
No, as far as I understand is whenever it's a releasing club, the commission there's no mandatory provisions about it. It has to be made after the closure of the registration window for sure, and it has to be pro rata in accordance with the transfer fee.
Okay.
So if the transfer fee is paid in 5 installments, let's say during the past 2 years, you cannot get everything of the commission. You have to receive the commission pro rata in accordance with the transfer, with the installments.
And I guess the same goes to the conditional payments in a normal contract.
Yes.
You receive them when? After the player gets the money, or like at the end of the season, or as an extra payment calculated 2 months after the end of the season?
So there's 2 aspects to consider first. If the general rule that I was mentioning is that every 3 months. So if the players, let's do an easy case, no? The players play on a monthly basis. So even if the player during the first 2 months already received that money, which out of which the commission will be calculated, you cannot get paid until the 3 months have passed. The second one is it's only the actual money received. So if you have a conditional payment that it's only triggered on month 4, let's say, because of goals scored, for example. So on month 4, that commission will be due now, but you also have to wait to the next payment, which is 2 months before.
And the calculations and the invoices, I think it's a bit complicated, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I hate doing disclaimers because I'm here to answer questions. But don't kill the messenger. This is FIFA doing it. We had some input. We tried to make it as reasonable as possible, but certainly it's gonna be complicated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. We've got one at the front here, please. Maria, don't worry, I'll be your bodyguard when you leave here, okay? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Christian, I'm an agent. Just a scenario. Let's say that I have a player, he doesn't earn a lot of money, he plays in wherever, and then the club approaches me, my own player, and say, okay, we want to sell your player. Can you please go in the market and see if you can find a club who wants to buy it? Now I have a representation agreement with the player, and I basically need to help the selling club to sell the player. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to terminate the contract with the player and help the club, or am I going to help the player and help the club at the same time, and who's going to pay?
Great question. So, let's start with the easy one, and then I try to move to this. FIFA calls it, when these transactions are done in bad faith, FIFA calls it switching. I guess you know maybe even more than me, which is that you are the agent of the player, and then you switch on that transaction to represent the releasing club, and then you switch again. In the scenario that you mentioned is, nothing prevents you, as far as I remember, to have different representation agreements. The multiple representation is forbidden in that per transaction basis. So first, even if you have a representation agreement with the player, you can still sign a representation agreement with the club for a different transaction, let's say. The problem is that if you represent that releasing club on that transaction, you will be prevented from representing the player under that transaction. So, I mean, I don't want to say what you can do or circumvention, but I guess that if I want to play it safe, what I would potentially do is suspend my representation agreement with the player, which means that on that transaction I'm not going anymore, that representation agreement is not in force. Sign the representation agreement with the releasing club, try to find a club for that player, and then you can the commission can be due out of that transfer fee that you get. Nevertheless, the player will have to find a new agent for that transaction.
So a player he needs to have an agent before he can switch clubs. He cannot negotiate his own contract.
He can. For example, I mean, that's an even better solution. You can tell the player just to basically represent himself on that transaction. Actually. And one point that is important is clauses in representation agreements that prevent the player from representing himself or that provide for a penalty fee if he represents himself are null and void. They are not allowed. So yeah, I guess you will tell the player, represent yourself in this one. I mean, I don't want to do this because it sounds bad, but represent yourself on this one, and then, of course, you will not have a contractual basis to claim commission from him if he doesn't want to pay you. But I guess it's a trust issue as well. So I guess.
Any more questions? Yeah, there's one here at the front.
Jonathan from TransferRoom. We've seen the provisional sanctions for agents if they breach the cap or if they transfer minors. Are there any indications of what punishments will come clubs' way if they also breach any of the regulations?
Yeah, it will be, I mean, there's not an exhaustive list. It will have to be dealt with under the FIFA disciplinary code. You have, I don't remember now the article, but you have a list that goes either from a warning to a relegation, and it has like a 20 kind of list. I guess the FIFA disciplinary committee will assess a breach and then decide which sanction is proportionate and reasonable. But as I was mentioning, I would be careful at least at the beginning because FIFA will have to build up a kind of an approach to these cases. And in my personal opinion, I think FIFA will have to go hard on this. Otherwise, everybody will just say, it's a fine of 20,000. Who cares? So maybe a registration ban, depending on the breach, things like that. Yeah.
You spoke before about other services. Could we just be a bit clearer exactly what that covers so that people are aware? Because this gentleman here raised a very interesting scenario. I guess that could also fall into that potentially.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit of tricky because it's not an exhaustive list. So you can think of very absurd scenarios where where an agent and a club sign for the agent to organize an event for the club as an event organizer. So, I mean, the regulations really provide the obvious ones, as I was mentioning, legal services, accounting services, scouting services, financial planning. But you can think of absurd scenarios where an agent is providing any service to the client. So it can be, for example, to serve as an au pair of the player's songs. So I mean, that's a service. And if you interpret the regulations really broad, that could potentially be as well. Now, I think here comes with, of course, it's never easy to find a proper standard, but it's really reasonable. And I think the service should have to be somehow linked to the agent services in some way or form. I don't think that FIFA could reasonably interpret these kind of absurd scenarios as being other services. I don't think so. But it's not clear.
And then, more so from a club perspective, will the FAR allow clubs to promise to agents that they'll engage him in a future transfer of a player?
Yeah, this is another complicated one. This actually, it's cases where an agent, let's say, does a service for an engaging club for free, but in exchange, it tells the agent, I will engage you in the future transfer of a player. And then that's kind of the payment, let's say. I think that would have to be on a case-by-case basis, always under the analysis of the conflict of interest kind of position. So that practice is not explicitly forbidden by the regulations, but it may be scrutinized by FIFA. I think those are the situations where FIFA will have to look at this and see exactly the whole concept of the transfer and of the transaction, what does it entail. If there is a sell-on fee payment, for example, in favor of the agent, for example, that's not allowed. Let's say that the engaging club says, I am not going to pay you now, but whenever I transfer the player in the future, you get 10% of the sum. That's not allowed. That's you can argue whether it's TPO or not, but the FIFA is more clear on that sense that that's not allowed. The promise to engage you, that's a bit more nuanced, and I think it would really have to be on how FIFA sees that case in terms of conflict of interest. Now, one important nuance is, remember that FIFA's jurisdiction will only be whenever there is an international aspect of a transaction. So if it's an agent, and the international aspect of it is on the transaction, not on the nationalities. So if you're, let's say, an Italian agent, and then you have your player that is in Ajax, and then you transfer him to PSD, that's nothing to do with FIFA. That will only be the regulations of the Dutch FA that may deviate from the FAR in certain aspects, actually.
That was really a good point there. Is there any more questions? Okay, we have one at the front. Thank you.
So you talked about individual agents not being able to fulfill the multi-representation. What about two agents working for the same agency under individual licenses? Can they represent the selling club and the player if they work for the same agency? And if not, as I can see that, anticipating that, do you anticipate cooperation between different agencies and that aspect sort of developing further?
Yeah, I mean the first is a no, because that will qualify, those things will be connected football agents. So that's not allowed. Now, as the second part, I do think that what agencies will try to look for is try to dilute that connection as much as possible. Maybe you can form some type of very indirect joint venture or some other kind of commercial transaction. Now, even if you do that, nothing would prevent that FIFA looks into it and says, you know what, this is connected for me, because that's a bit of a tricky, as I was mentioning, this is all very subjective sometimes. So if there is a clear Chinese wall between the agencies, probably it flies, but if there's some kind of connection that FIFA may look into this and start asking for information, and then if you don't want to disclose that, that will be not look well for FIFA, and if you start disclosing it, you say, well, you are indeed connected, then I'm treating you as a connected football agent, you should not do this, so a sanction would come. So it all comes down to the creativity between agencies.
Thank you so much, Mario, for giving your knowledge there on behalf of the European Club Association. It was very useful. I'm sure a lot of people will have questions that come to their mind after this session. We're going to break now for a 15-minute break, but Mario will be here for the first session that starts at 11:45. So please be prompt to your first one-on-one meetings. I know you already know the drill, but just to try and keep things quick, exchange business cards at the start, please. And we wish you a really successful day. Thank you.